Hello and welcome to Clear Sky Studios channel, where we'll explore topics about home recording and playing electric guitar in a local cover band. Today I want to cover two topics. The first one is to see if there's any difference about putting effects before a cab block or after a cab block in your modeler. And the second is a related question about whether we should put delay into reverb or reverb into delay, or to see if there's any difference between those two things. So first of all, let's think about why is it important to think about the position of effects before or after a cabinet block. Let's go look at my typical setup. So here's my typical gigging setup. I use a quad cortex with an MC8. That goes into a power cab. Now I typically use the power cab in flat mode with the LF raw voicing. Essentially what that does is it gives me a raw speaker cabinet. It's basically a powered guitar speaker with no tweeter, no processing at all in the power cab. And so the quad cortex would not have a cab block in that. And if you look closely here, you can see that, let's see if you can see that. Output 1 and 3 does not have a cab block, but you can see I do have a parallel path that does have a cab block that's going out through output 1 and 2. What that's for is to be able to send a signal to the front of the house PA system, which also goes into my in-ear monitors, and that does need a cab block. So why do I do this? Well, I do this because the power cab sounds better if it's just treated as a guitar cabinet. In fact, I referenced it with this Hot Rod Deluxe over here, which has a G12M65 Celestion in it. Pretty good sounding speaker, and it actually references quite well. So this gives us more of that amp in the room sound, and you don't get any of the sort of bright artifacts that can sometimes come from using an impulse response. In a studio, typically effects like chorus, delay, and reverb, these are effects that would typically go after the amp. In your guitar setup, your live guitar setup, these would often come between the power amp and the speaker, so they would be before the speaker in the guitar amp's effects loop. So in this case, the effects would be before the speaker cabinet, not after. So the question is, does that make any difference? And the reason we want to think about that is because in my live setup, my in-ear monitors are going through a cab block with all of the effects before them, whereas I would typically have had those effects after the cab block. So how are we going to figure that out? Well, let's go over here in Logic and take a look and see how we might figure that out. So I've got two tracks in Logic that are of interest here. Well, actually three. So the first one is this dry guitar track. This is just a recording of my dry guitar that came straight out of the quad cortex. There's no effects or anything on that. That track goes out through a bus, which is fed into the input to all of these other tracks to ensure that all these tracks are getting exactly the same input. So in this first channel, we have a typical guitar setup here. I'm using Helix Native for this because it's very convenient to use. We have a distortion block, an amplifier. I think in this case it's a Mesa Boogie Lone Star model that we're using, followed by a cabinet, one of the new 3.5 cab blocks. And then that feeds our after the amp effects like they would in a studio. We've got a chorus, a delay, and a reverb. So this would have been my typical guitar setup where the output would go into a full frequency flat response Furfer cabinet. Then over here in this track, we've got it called cabinet at the end. It's exactly the same track as before. In fact, it's a copy of that track, except I have moved the speaker to the end of the signal chain. So all of those effects are now before the speaker instead of after the speaker. So let's listen to those two tracks and see if they sound different to us. Cabinet before the effects first. Now let's listen to the cabinet after the effects. sounds pretty much the same. Let's A/B them back and forth and see if we can hear any difference. I can't hear any difference between them, but let's go a step further. We can use what's called a null test to listen to just the difference between two tracks. The way we do that is we take this second track and we add a gain block to it, and that gain block reverses the phase. You see, I've reversed the phase on that track. So this track is the same as the other track, except for two things. One is that the speaker is at the end of the signal chain instead of before the effects. And the other is that its phase is reversed 180 degrees. So if we add those two things together, then if these two tracks are identical, we should hear almost nothing. So let's try that. And that does seem to be the case. There's a little bit of reverb left, and that's likely because the reverb reflections are probably use some random number generating that might be subtly different in timing across the two tracks, because there are actually two instances of Helix Native running at the same time here. So they might be a little bit different, but that's substantial information. In fact, if we look at the output, you see it's way down here, minus 40 or 50 dB. That's pretty quiet. So these are essentially the same. So that kind of proves that putting effects before the speaker or after the speaker cabinet model doesn't really make that much difference. But that's only the case if the effects are linear. And that's what we would expect, because things that are linear would all add together. You wouldn't expect it to make any difference. Where it would make a difference is if the block in the signal path was nonlinear. Something like a compressor, for example, might behave differently if it's seeing the output from a speaker versus seeing the output without the speaker, because the frequency response driving into the compressor would be very different, and the compressor would react differently to that different frequency range. So this will only work if the effects that are after the speaker are linear. So you might find that if you do have compressors in your signal chain, or anything that distorts in that signal chain after the amp block and before the speaker, this process might not work, and you might hear a difference between having the cabinet before the effects versus after the effects. Okay, now let's look at our second thing that we wanted to talk about. We wanted to look at delay before reverb, where we're essentially reverberating the delays, versus reverb before the delay, or delaying the reverbs. So we can use the null test in a similar way to see what that difference is. So I've got that same track before that we started with, cab before effects. And you can see in this one the delay is before the reverb, which I would typically do. But then down here we have another track. Let's just open that one up. And we can see that this track is identical to the other, except we have flipped the reverb into the delay instead of the delay and reverb. So we've just flipped those two blocks around. And we put our gain block again on with it out of phase so that we can do our null test. So let's listen to those two tracks and see if we can hear any difference. Here's the delay before reverb. But let's add them together and let the null test show us what the difference is between them. Again, the null test is telling us that reverb after delay or reverb before delay isn't making much difference at all. And again, that's what we would expect, because in this case both of these blocks are linear. All right, so that's what we wanted to cover for today. We saw that putting the cab block at the end of the signal chain after the post amps effects into the front of the house and in-ear monitors doesn't change the tone of those effects if they go into a straight guitar cabinet like the Power Cab in raw mode. And we found that we didn't really need to worry very much about whether we have delay before or after reverb, as long as there's no distortion. So in Helix, for example, if you're hitting a reverb or a delay pretty hard, you might actually cause some distortion in those blocks themselves. They're designed to be distorted. So you might make sure that you increase the headroom parameter on those blocks to make sure there's no distortion when they're used after the amp. All right, well, leave a comment with your experiences. Thanks for watching, and I'll have more content like this coming as we go. Bye for now.